All right, ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling Daniel C. Dennett's Content and Consciousness.
Oh, a classic.
It really is, and it grapples with this huge question. How do we connect our everyday talk about minds, like, beliefs, desires, feelings, with the hard science, the physical world?
It's a question that's been bugging philosophers forever. Can science really capture the richness of our inner experience?
Right. And Dennett starts by bringing up the intentionalist thesis.
Which basically argues that our mental vocabulary, all those words about thinking, believing, wanting, just don't fit into a purely scientific explanation.
Exactly. They're like oil and water. And instead of trying to pinpoint specific thoughts as brain processes, Dennett shifts the focus to the mind as a whole, as an intentional system.
It's a fascinating approach. He's interested in the function of the mind, how it works to solve problems and navigate the world.
So we're not looking for the thinking neuron, we're looking at the whole system, the mind working as a unit.
Precisely. And this leads us to a central mystery: intentionality.
Ah, yes, intentionality. This is where things get really interesting.
This idea, going back to Brentano, is that our mental states are always about something. Like, John hates spinach. That thought has a specific target: spinach.
And that's where things get tricky, right? How do you translate that aboutness into the language of neurons and synapses? How can a physical system have thoughts about things?
It's like trying to explain the taste of chocolate by listing its chemical compounds. It just doesn't quite capture it.
Exactly.
So, Dennett suggests a clever move. Instead of wrestling with the phenomenon of intentionality itself, he shifts our attention to the sentences we use to describe it.
So understand the language of thought before cracking the code of the brain itself.
Precisely. Like learning the rules of grammar before writing a novel.
I like that analogy.
And this brings in the concept of intentionality from logic. It highlights the unique way meaning works in language.
Oh, I'm all ears. This sounds fascinating.
Think about it. Clark Kent and Superman refer to the same person. But the sentence, Lois Lane loves Clark Kent, might not be true, even if Lois Lane loves Superman is true.
So even though it's the same guy, our beliefs about them can be different.
Exactly. And that illustrates the challenge of reducing intentional sentences, those about mental states, to purely extensional ones, the kind that just describe what exists in the world. There's not a simple one-to-one mapping.
That's a real head-scratcher. It seems like language itself might hold some clues about how our minds work, even if those clues are tricky to decipher.
Exactly. And this leads Dennett to critique behaviorism, the school of thought that tried to explain everything about the mind through observable behavior.
Behaviorism always struck me as a bit limited.
Limited how?
Well, it felt like it could tell you what someone does, but not really why they do it. Like it's missing something crucial.
You're spot on. And that's precisely Dennett's point. Behaviorism is great for gathering data, but it struggles to explain the content of mental states, that aboutness we were talking about. He uses the classic example of a rat learning to navigate a maze.
Ah, the maze-running rat.
Yeah.
A staple of psychology experiments.
A behaviorist might say the rat just learns a sequence of movements. Turn left, turn right, go straight.
But Dennett says there's more to it, right?
Right. He argues that the rat actually learned something much deeper: where the food is. It's not just about movement. It's about understanding the layout of the maze and having a goal in mind.
That makes sense. To capture that kind of knowledge, you need to talk about goals, beliefs, understanding, things that go beyond just the observable actions.
Exactly. And Dennett suggests that this requires intelligent storage of information.
Intelligent storage. Okay, let's unpack that. What does he mean?
Well, he argues that for systems to be intentional, like our brains, they can't just passively store information. The information has to be stored in a way that can be used by the system.
So it's not just like data on a hard drive. It's more like having a dynamic library where information is constantly being accessed, organized, and put to use.
A perfect analogy. And a key criterion for this intelligent storage is the appropriateness of the system's behavior to its needs. In other words, an organism's actions should make sense, given its goals and the environment it finds itself in.
So like a squirrel burying a nut for the winter, it's not just randomly stashing nuts, it's storing them in a way that makes sense for its future needs.
Precisely. And Dennett connects this to evolution.
How so?
He suggests that both species and the neural structures within an individual evolve to favor those structures that lead to appropriate, successful behavior.
So it's like our brains are constantly being shaped by our experiences, selecting for the neural pathways that help us survive and thrive.
It's like a kind of natural selection happening inside our heads.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. But here's a question that pops into my head. if we're moving away from finding specific meaning neurons in the brain, how do we actually figure out what those internal states mean? How do we ascribe content to them?
That's a fantastic question, and it leads to one of Dennett's most important insights. Instead of looking for a perfect match between brain activity and words, he suggests we focus on the functional role of those internal states.
So, less about finding a brain dictionary and more about understanding what those brain states do in the context of the organism's behavior.
Exactly. It's about asking, how does this activity contribute to appropriate behavior based on the information the organism is receiving from the world?
So, let's say we observe an organism that consistently moves toward food whenever it's present.
Okay, following.
We can infer that the organism recognizes food, not because we found a little food neuron firing, but because its behavior suggests it's responding to food in a meaningful way.
That's it. You got it. It's about understanding the function of brain activity in guiding behavior, not about finding little word labels for every blip in the brain.
This is all really fascinating, but it seems to clash with this common intuition we have about our minds. The idea that we experience mental images as little pictures in our heads.
Ah, yes, the pictures in the head metaphor. It's very tempting, isn't it?
It is. But is Dennett saying those mental pictures aren't real? Are we completely off base with that intuition?
He's not denying that we have experiences that feel like we're seeing mental pictures. But he argues that if you take this idea literally, it leads to all sorts of problems.
Like what?
Well, for one, if our conscious experience is just a series of pictures, then who or what is watching those pictures? Do we need another little viewer inside our heads and then another one inside that head and so on? It becomes absurd.
So the problem isn't the experience of a mental image itself. It's how we try to explain it, that literal picture in the head idea.
Exactly. He points out that the last actual physical image in the whole process of perception is the one formed on the retina at the back of your eye.
Right, like a camera.
Exactly. Everything that happens after that, all the processing in the brain, is about abstract representation, not the manipulation of miniature pictures.
So maybe instead of thinking of mental images as things, we should be thinking of them as processes.
Precisely. The experience of a mental image arises from complex neural activity, not from some tiny projector playing a movie in our minds.
That makes a lot more sense when you put it that way. This whole idea of the brain as an active constructor, not just passively receiving information, really ties into his discussion of color perception too, right?
Absolutely. Color is another great example.
We were talking about that earlier, how physical properties like wavelengths of light somehow become the experience of seeing red or blue. It's always felt a bit magical to me.
And Dennett wants to demystify that magic. He argues that color is something our brains actively do, not something they passively receive.
So instead of thinking about color as a property that's just out there in the world, we should think about it as something our brains construct.
Exactly. And those constructions have been shaped by evolution to be useful for our survival.
So color isn't just about beauty or aesthetics, it's about information that helps us navigate the world, find food, avoid danger.
Precisely. Color perception is a great example of how our brains create our reality based on the information they receive.
This whole idea of the brain as an active constructor is really shifting my perspective. It makes you wonder about the nature of consciousness itself. If our brains are always interpreting and creating, where does awareness fit into all of this?
That's where Dennett's distinction between two types of awareness comes in. He calls them awareness 1 and awareness 2. He argues that a lot of confusion about consciousness comes from mixing these two up.
Okay, I'm ready to untangle this. What's the difference between awareness 1 and awareness 2?
Awareness 1 is the kind of awareness that allows us to verbally report on our mental states. It's tied to language and introspection and is considered unique to humans.
So when I'm sitting here reflecting on my own thoughts, analyzing my feelings, that's awareness 1 in action.
Precisely. It's that ability to turn our mental gaze inward and think about thinking.
And awareness 2.
Awareness 2 is a more fundamental form of awareness that's found in animals and even some machines.
So like a dog being aware of a bone would be awareness 2, while a human reflecting on their own thoughts would be awareness 1.
Perfect example. It's about the level of complexity and self-reflection involved.
And Dennett's point is that we shouldn't confuse these two types, right?
Exactly. Just because a dog can respond to a bone doesn't mean it's having the same kind of conscious experience as a human, pondering the meaning of life.
This distinction makes me think about thinking to oneself, something we often take for granted as central to our experience.
And this is where Dennett gets really radical.
How so?
He challenges this assumption that we control our actions through conscious thought. He suggests that much of what we perceive as conscious control might actually be an illusion.
Hold on. You mean when I'm trying to decide whether to get out of bed and I think I should really get up now? Dennett's saying that thought might not be doing anything.
He's saying it's more complicated than that.
Okay, help me out here. How is it more complicated?
Often the thought is just a side effect of a brain state that's already moving towards action. The brain might already be prepping to get you out of bed, and the thought is just, well, tagging along.
So my brain is making the decision, and my conscious mind is just narrating the process after it's already happened. That's a wild thought.
It is. And Dennett links this to language. We form sentences to express our motivations, which can make us think those sentences cause the action. But it might be the other way around.
So our inner monologues are more like commentators than the coaches calling the plays.
Hmm.
This is really making me question how much control we actually have.
It's a big question, and it leads
Yeah.
to even bigger questions about free will and responsibility. If our conscious thoughts aren't always in control, what does that mean for our sense of agency?
Dennett has definitely given us a lot to chew on in this first part of our deep dive. From intentionality and the limits of behaviorism to the idea that our brains are active constructors of reality and these two tricky types of awareness. There's so much to unpack here, and I can't wait to see where this exploration takes us next.
It really does make you wonder, doesn't it? About those stories we tell ourselves about our own minds, like we're somehow in the driver's seat.
It's a powerful illusion. And speaking of stories, Dennett really dismantles this whole idea of mental images being like little pictures projected onto a screen inside our heads.
Right. It's such a tempting metaphor, but it just doesn't hold up under scrutiny.
He uses this funny analogy of a car engine that's hooked up to a TZ camera so the engine can see where
Okay.
it's going.
It's brilliant because it highlights the absurdity of the idea.
Why would an engine need to see?
Exactly. There's nothing there to interpret the image, no mind's eye to watch the picture. It wouldn't make any difference to the engine's functioning.
So it's like having a picture without a viewer.
Precisely. And Dennett says the same logic applies to these so-called mental images. If our conscious experience were just a series of pictures, who or what would be watching them? It creates this infinite regress.
It's like those nested Russian dolls. You open one and there's another one inside and another and another.
Exactly. It just keeps going. So he's not saying we don't have experiences that feel like mental pictures, but he's challenging that literal picture in the head explanation.
Right. So how does he explain these experiences then? If it's not little pictures in our heads, what's going on?
He argues that the experience of a mental image is the result of complex neural activity. It's a process, not a thing.
Ah, so instead of thinking about mental images as things, we should be thinking of them as processes.
Exactly. And those processes have evolved to help us simulate scenarios, plan for the future, and make decisions. It's about representing possibilities, not projecting tiny pictures.
It's all about the brain doing what it does best, processing information in incredibly complex and sophisticated ways.
Precisely. And this whole idea of the brain as an active constructor, not just passively receiving information, but shaping it, making meaning, really ties into his discussion of color perception, too.
Right, we were talking about that earlier, how physical properties like wavelengths of light somehow become the experience of red or blue. It's always felt a bit magical to me.
Dennett wants to demystify that magic. He argues that color is something our brains actively do, not something they passively receive.
So it's not that colors are just out there in the world waiting to be perceived. Our brains actually construct the experience of color.
Exactly. And those constructions have been shaped by evolution to be useful for our survival.
That makes sense. Color helps us distinguish between things, make sense of our environment, like knowing which berries are ripe and which ones are poisonous.
Precisely. So color isn't just about beauty or aesthetics. It's about information that helps us navigate the world.
Wow, that really changes how you feel about something as basic as seeing color. It's not just passive perception. It's an active process of construction happening in our brains.
That's one of the key takeaways from Dennett's work. Our brains are constantly creating our reality based on the information they receive. And that creation process is incredibly sophisticated.
So we've got these brains that are always busy constructing and interpreting, but where does consciousness itself fit into this picture? How do we become aware of all this processing that's going on? How do we experience the world rather than just passively processing information?
That's where Dennett's famous distinction between those two types of awareness comes back into play. Awareness 1 and awareness 2.
Ah, yes, awareness one and awareness two. It feels like we've been circling around these concepts throughout our conversation.
And that's because they're so central to understanding Dennett's view of consciousness.
Can you remind me again, what's the key difference between these two types of awareness?
Sure. Awareness 1 is the kind of awareness that lets us talk about our mental states. It's deeply tied to language and introspection, and it's generally considered unique to humans.
So is that ability to think about thinking, to reflect on our own thoughts and feelings?
Exactly. Whereas awareness 2 is a more basic kind of awareness. It's about responding to information, using it to guide behavior. And it's not limited to humans. We see it in animals and even in some machines.
So a dog being aware of a bone would be awareness two, while a human reflecting on their own thoughts would be awareness.
Perfect example. And Dennis' point is that we often get these two types of awareness mixed up, which leads to a lot of confusion about consciousness.
Right, because we use the word awareness in so many different ways, but it's not all the same kind of awareness.
Exactly. And when we assume that every time an animal responds to something, it's having the same kind of conscious experience we have when we're thinking about our thoughts, we're making a big mistake.
We're projecting our own human-centric way of experiencing the world onto other creatures.
Exactly. Just because a dog can catch a ball doesn't mean it's having a little inner monologue about the trajectory of the ball and the best strategy for catching it.
It might just be acting on instinct or on some lower level of awareness that doesn't involve those kinds of conscious thoughts.
Precisely. And Dennett is trying to bring some much-needed clarity to these discussions about consciousness by carefully distinguishing between these different types of awareness.
This all makes me think about the role of language in shaping our experience. Dennett seems to be suggesting that language is essential for awareness one, for that kind of self-reflective awareness that we humans have.
He does make a strong case for that. Our ability to use language to turn thoughts into words and sentences gives us the power to look inward, to become aware of our own minds in a way that other animals can't.
So language isn't just a tool for communication, it's also a tool for creating consciousness itself.
That's the argument. Language gives us this incredible capacity to represent our own thoughts to ourselves, which allows for that higher level of self-awareness.
But if language is so crucial for consciousness, does that mean animals without language are just living in some kind of unreflective darkness, like they're just going through the motions without any real awareness of what they're doing?
I don't think Dennett would say they're living in darkness. They might have rich inner experiences. It's just that those experiences are shaped by awareness too, not awareness.
So it's not that they're lacking something that we have, they just have something different.
Exactly. It's like comparing apples and oranges. They're both fruits, but they have different flavors and textures. And consciousness, according to Dennett, comes in different flavors as well.
I love that analogy. It helps to break down this very human-centric way of thinking about consciousness. It's not a binary on or off switch, it's more like a spectrum.
Exactly. And understanding this spectrum is key to appreciating the diversity of minds in the world, both human and non-human.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, some of these ideas are pretty challenging to wrap my head around. Like this whole idea that my conscious thoughts might not be as powerful as I always thought, that maybe they're not actually driving my actions. It's a little unsettling.
It's definitely a mind-bending idea,
Hmm.
but Dennett presents a lot of evidence to support it.
Yeah.
And even if it's unsettling, it can also be incredibly liberating.
Liberating. How so? Right now, I'm feeling more existential dread than liberation.
Well, think about it this way. If we let go of this idea that we're always in control, that our conscious minds are calling all the shots, we can also let go of some of the pressure and anxiety that comes with that belief.
I see what you mean. It's like we can be a little kinder to ourselves.
Exactly. We can accept that our minds are more complex than we often give them credit for, and that sometimes our conscious thoughts are just along for the ride.
So it's not about constantly battling for control against this unruly mind. It's more about accepting that it works in mysterious and often surprising ways.
Exactly. And maybe that acceptance can free us up to focus on other things, like cultivating good habits, making choices that align with our values, and creating a life that feels meaningful.
This almost sounds like a form of therapy.
It's not that far off. Dennett's work has actually been really influential in fields like psychology and neuroscience. People are using his ideas to try to understand how we can live better, more fulfilling lives.
It's like a philosophical approach to self-improvement.
You could say that. It's about working with our minds, not against them, accepting their complexity, and finding ways to thrive within that complexity.
This deep dive has definitely taken us down some unexpected paths. We've challenged the idea that our conscious minds are always in control. We've explored this notion that our brains are constantly creating our reality. And we've untangled these tricky concepts of awareness and consciousness.
We've covered a lot of ground, and it's clear that Dennett's Content and Consciousness is a book that keeps on giving.
It really is a treasure trove of insights. And there's still one more piece of the puzzle I want to explore with you, the concept of understanding itself.
Understanding. That's a big one.
It really is. Dennett dedicates a whole chapter to this, and he connects it to the idea of knowledge, which is another one of those notoriously slippery concepts in philosophy.
We all want to understand things, right? But what does it actually mean to understand something, as opposed to just knowing a bunch of facts? That's where Dennett takes us.
Right. He uses the simple example of a child learning about the number 4.
I remember that example.
The child can memorize all sorts of facts about 4, but does that mean they really understand what 4 is?
That's the key question, isn't it? And Dennett argues that true understanding involves more than just accumulating facts. It's
Yeah.
about being able to use that information in a flexible and adaptive way.
So it's not just about what you know, it's about what you can do with what you know.
Precisely. He suggests that understanding is always contextual. It's about how information connects to other information and how we use it to solve problems, make sense of the world, make those connections.
This reminds me of something I read about information theory. How the amount of information conveyed by a message depends on the receiver's existing knowledge.
That's a crucial point. So what's news to one person might be old hat to someone else. It's not just about the message itself, but about the interaction between the message and the mind receiving it.
It's like two people looking at the same painting. One person might just see colors and shapes, while someone with a background in art history might see a whole world of symbolism, technique, and meaning.
That's a great analogy. It highlights how understanding is this dynamic process that involves both the information being presented and the cognitive framework of the person receiving that information. It's not a one-way street.
This makes me think about the challenges of teaching and learning. It's not enough to just transmit information. You have to create the right conditions for understanding to happen.
Exactly. And Dennett is really challenging us to rethink our traditional approaches to knowledge and understanding, to move away from this idea that knowledge is just a collection of isolated facts.
So it's not like a mental Lego set where you just snap together these pre-made pieces of information.
Right. It's much more organic than that. He argues that knowledge is more like a web, a complex network of interconnected ideas.
Where everything is related to everything else.
Exactly. It's a dynamic system,
Yeah.
constantly evolving. And it's shaped by our individual experiences and perspectives. We each bring our own unique lens to the process of understanding.
So there's no single right way to understand something.
Precisely. There are multiple perspectives, multiple layers of meaning. And the process of understanding is always ongoing.
It's like we're all explorers, mapping out our own unique territories of knowledge.
And those maps are constantly being updated and revised as we encounter new information and new experiences. It's a lifelong journey.
Dennett's Content and Consciousness has really given us a lot to ponder, hasn't it? We've explored the nature of mental images, the different types of awareness, this idea of the mind as an active constructor, and even the very concept of understanding itself.
It's been a whirlwind tour of some incredibly complex ideas, but I think we're starting to see the world a little differently.
I know I am. And there's still one final concept I want to explore with you. This idea that our minds are essentially intentional systems.
Yes, intentional systems. This is where it all comes together.
We've been talking about intentionality throughout our conversation, but what does it actually mean to say that our minds are systems that operate in this intentional way?
That's where the real magic happens. And that's what we'll be diving into in the final part of our deep dive into Dennett's Content and Consciousness.
All right, we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into Dennett's Content and Consciousness. We left off with this idea of the mind as an intentional system. It sounds a bit like, philosophical jargon.
It does have a kind of technical ring to it, doesn't it?
It does. Can we break it down? What does it actually mean?
Well, for Dennett, it's a really crucial concept. It's kind of the key to how he connects our everyday talk about minds with the scientific view of the world.
Okay, we've been using this word intentionality a lot, this idea that our mental states are always about something. But how does that connect to the idea of the mind being a system?
Right. Well, think about what we mean when we talk about a system. We're talking about a bunch of interconnected parts that work together to do something, to perform some function.
Okay, like a car engine or a computer.
Exactly. And an intentional system is a system whose behavior can be best explained by attributing to it things like beliefs, desires, and goals.
Hmm.
Those mental states that have that aboutness quality.
So instead of trying to pinpoint individual thoughts in specific neurons, we're looking at how the whole system, the brain, the body, the way it interacts with the world, generates behavior that's directed towards goals.
Precisely. It's a way of looking at the mind as a complex, adaptive system that's evolved to navigate the world and achieve goals.
This makes me think about those early attempts at creating artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
They thought they could just program a computer with a bunch of facts and rules and boom, you have AI. But it turned out to be way more complicated than that.
It's true.
Hmm.
Real intelligence, whether we're talking about humans or machines, isn't just about storing information. It's about being able to use that information in a flexible and adaptive way to solve problems, respond to changes.
So being able to learn from your mistakes, come up with new strategies.
Exactly, to make predictions, adjust your behavior, all that good stuff.
So even a simple organism, like, I don't know, a single-celled amoeba that moves toward a food source,
Sure.
that could be considered an intentional system in a very basic sense.
In a way, yes. It doesn't have conscious thoughts or a complex inner life like we do. But its behavior can be understood by attributing to it a simple goal to get nutrients. And it acts in a way that's consistent with that goal.
It's amazing to think that something as complex as the human mind might be a kind of intentional system that evolved over millions of years from those simpler forms.
It's humbling, isn't it, when you think about the vastness of time and the incredible power of evolution.
It really is. But what does this view tell us about consciousness? Is consciousness just another word for a really sophisticated, intentional system?
That's where things get even more interesting, and it's one of the most important points Dennett makes. He argues that consciousness isn't a separate thing. It's not like some magical ingredient that gets sprinkled on top of certain intentional systems.
So not like a soul or some kind of mysterious mind stuff.
Exactly. Dennett says that consciousness is actually a product of the complex ways in which intentional systems interact with the world and with themselves.
So consciousness isn't something you have or don't have. It's more like a spectrum, a matter of degrees.
That's a great way to put it. And the degree of consciousness is closely tied to the complexity of the intentional system. As an intentional system gets more sophisticated, more capable of processing information, more able to reflect on itself, well, its consciousness also becomes more rich and nuanced.
It's like those two types of awareness we talked about, awareness one and awareness two. Those are like points on a continuum of consciousness.
Right. With simpler organisms having basic forms of awareness too, and humans, with our language and introspection, having a much higher level of awareness.
So maybe consciousness is more like a dimmer switch than an on-off switch.
I like that analogy. It captures this idea that consciousness is not an all-or-nothing phenomenon. It emerges gradually as intentional systems evolve and become more complex.
This whole idea of the mind as an intentional system, it's a pretty different way of thinking about consciousness than what we're used to, isn't it?
It is. And it has some pretty mind-blowing implications.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for one, it challenges the idea that consciousness is unique to humans.
Oh, right, because if consciousness is a product of intentional systems, and we see simpler forms of intentional systems in other animals.
Then it follows that those animals might also have some degree of consciousness, right?
Exactly. Maybe not exactly like ours, but some kind of experience. It's really exciting and a little bit scary to think about.
It is. Dennett cautions us against projecting our own human-centric view of consciousness onto other creatures. We need to be more open-minded about the possibilities.
So instead of asking if a dog is conscious in the same way a human is, we should be asking what kind of consciousness a dog might have given its capabilities and how it interacts with the world.
Precisely. And this view also opens up the possibility of creating artificial consciousness. If we can build machines that operate as complex, intentional systems, those machines might also have some form of consciousness. It might not be exactly like human consciousness, but it would be something genuinely new and unique.
It's like something out of science fiction.
It does sound futuristic, doesn't it?
Right.
But it's a question that AI researchers are taking very seriously. And Dennett's work helps us to think about these possibilities in a rigorous and grounded way.
This whole conversation has really changed how I think about consciousness. Dennett's ideas are definitely complex, but they provide this amazing new framework for understanding ourselves and our place in the world.
That's what makes philosophy so powerful. It gives us these new lenses through which to see the world.
It's been an amazing journey. We've explored the mysteries of intentionality, the limits of behaviorism, the idea of the brain as an active constructor, and the concept of understanding itself.
We even dipped our toes into the strange world of artificial consciousness.
And through it all, Dennett's Content and Consciousness has been our trusty guide.
It's a book that's packed with insights and challenges, and we've only just begun to unpack its riches. It's a book that keeps unfolding with each reading.
If you're listening and feeling inspired to explore these ideas further, I highly recommend checking out Content and Consciousness for yourself.
It's a challenge, but a rewarding one.
And remember, this journey of understanding, it never really ends.
There's always more to learn, more to question, more to discover about the world and about ourselves.
So keep those minds curious, keep asking those big questions, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.